Hey there, welcome to True Crime Records. Tonight, we're stepping into the quiet, haunting story of a man who lived hidden in plain sight for nearly 2 decades, someone so ordinary, so forgettable, that most people never thought twice about him. Gary Ridgway. To the world, he was just a soft-spoken factory worker, a man who mowed his lawn, nodded politely to neighbors, and blended into the Seattle suburbs without effort. But beneath that calm exterior lived a darkness no one imagined. Ridgway didn't draw attention. He didn't look dangerous. And that was exactly why he was. As families went about their lives, and the city drifted through foggy mornings and rainy nights, a quiet pattern began to form along the Green River: disappearances, fear, and whispered warnings that something was terribly wrong. And in the middle of it all, Ridgway walked among everyone else, unnoticed, living one life in public, and another in the shadows. Before we begin, let me know where you're listening from. It's always amazing seeing this late-night true crime community stretch across time zones. Now settle in. Let the day fade. And follow me into the stillness of the Pacific Northwest, into the case that baffled detectives, reshaped forensic science, and revealed how darkness can hide behind the most ordinary face. This is True Crime Records. And if you're new here, don't forget to subscribe. There's a new story waiting for you every night. Chapter 1, A Troubled Beginning, Childhood Shadows. Gary Leon Ridgway entered the world on February 18, 1949, in Salt Lake City, Utah. There was nothing unusual about his birth, nothing dramatic in the hospital records, nothing that set him apart from any other newborn wrapped tightly in a blanket and handed to hopeful parents. His early years, on paper, appeared almost painfully ordinary. But as with many stories that lead into darkness, the shadows began forming quietly, long before anyone realized they were there. His family moved frequently during his childhood, eventually settling in the suburbs of Seattle, a region known for its forests, rivers, and endless sheets of calm gray sky. The Pacific Northwest had a way of absorbing people, softening their edges with mist and silence. But for Gary, the backdrop of quiet neighborhoods and evergreen trees didn't bring comfort. Instead, it became the landscape where troubling impressions slowly took hold. His father, Thomas, worked driving buses and navigating long shifts that left little time for patient parenting. He was strict, distant, and often overwhelmed by the demands of the job. His mother, Mary, was stern and controlling, a woman whose intensity filled the home in ways Gary didn't know how to process. She was loud, sharp, and unfiltered in ways that left emotional marks deeper than she ever understood. Gary found himself caught between two powerful forces: the pressure to obey and the fear of disappointing a mother who rarely softened. From a young age, he was quiet, not shy, but muted, like someone watching the world from behind a sheet of glass. Teachers described him as slow, distracted, disconnected. He struggled in school in ways that didn't always make sense. At times he seemed lost inside his own thoughts, drifting into places no one else could enter. That distance made him an easy target for bullies, and those early years left him feeling isolated, misunderstood, and strangely separate from the children around him. In many ways, he experienced the world emotionally rather than intellectually. When other kids reacted in frustration or sadness, Gary reacted with silence. He didn't argue. He didn't fight back. He simply shut down, a pattern that followed him into adulthood with consequences no one could have predicted. At home, the atmosphere was tense. His parents argued frequently, their voices echoing through hallways and settling in corners like dust. Gary witnessed more than a child should, absorbing tension that he didn't know how to express. There were rumors, later in life, of intense discipline and a mother whose temper often outpaced her patience. Some said she demeaned her children. Others said she controlled the household with an iron will. Gary rarely spoke about his upbringing, but when he did, his descriptions lacked warmth. He talked about his childhood the way someone might describe a cold winter, distant, plain, and emotionally barren. One incident stood out, often repeated in documentaries and interviews. As a young boy, Gary was involved in a disturbing moment involving another child. The details shifted depending on who told the story, but the result remained the same: something violent happened, something that hinted at the darker impulses growing quietly inside him. Teachers noticed his emotional detachment afterward, but at the time, understanding child psychology wasn't nearly as advanced. Many simply shrugged, telling themselves that boys would be boys. But even then, Gary felt different, not in a dramatic or theatrical way, but in a subtle, internal disconnect that made it difficult for him to understand empathy or connection. When he spoke about it years later, his tone remained flat, like someone reading a grocery list. As Gary moved into his preteen years, the fractures in his emotional development deepened. He struggled socially, unable to create friendships that lasted beyond a few awkward conversations. While other boys competed in sports, discovered hobbies, or built after-school routines, Gary drifted. He wandered neighborhoods alone. He lingered by streams and quiet streets without purpose. He developed a habit of watching others from a distance, observing lives he didn't know how to join. His family noticed his withdrawn nature, but they interpreted it as shyness. They believed he'd grow out of it. They didn't understand that something internal was shifting, a slow unspooling of emotional wiring that left him increasingly detached from guilt, sympathy, and human connection. By the time he reached middle school, Gary was struggling academically. His IQ test suggested he was below average, and his reading abilities lagged significantly behind his classmates. Teachers placed him in remedial programs, but he drifted through them, absorbing little. He developed a pattern of following instructions without understanding them, completing tasks robotically, mimicking behaviors rather than internalizing them. This inability to engage meaningfully with people or ideas left him vulnerable to confusion and frustration. And because he lacked the emotional vocabulary to express either, he internalized everything. His world became a quiet, private space where thoughts moved unmonitored and unchallenged. The few students who interacted with him described him as strange, awkward, and distant. He didn't laugh at jokes. He didn't understand the rhythms of conversation. He didn't know how to participate in the simple exchange of emotions that children rely on to form friendships. Some kids avoided him. Others ignored him completely. And through it all, Gary adapted not by growing, but by hiding, by learning to appear unthreatening, unremarkable, invisible. By his early teens, this invisibility had become a kind of armor. He blended into the background effortlessly. He didn't cause trouble. He didn't make noise. Teachers sometimes forgot he was in class until attendance forced them to look his way. Neighbors referred to him as the quiet Ridgway boy. Even within the walls of his own home, he sometimes felt more like an observer than a participant. This ability to become unnoticeable would later shape the most chilling part of his adult life, the part that left investigators baffled for nearly 2 decades. But as a child, it simply made him seem harmless. And that's where the danger began. Because while silence can protect a child, for Gary Ridgway, it grew into something else entirely. A void. A place where empathy should have been. A stillness where emotional guidance never formed. A space that would later be filled with something far darker. As his childhood came to an end, Gary stood at the threshold of adolescence without the tools he needed to navigate human relationships. He didn't understand emotional boundaries. He didn't feel the same moral tug others described. And he didn't connect consequences with actions in the way most people do. These early fractures didn't define him yet. But they laid the foundation. A quiet boy in a quiet neighborhood, carrying shadows no one fully saw. And soon, those shadows would begin to take shape. Chapter 2: growing up in the shadow of violence. Gary Ridgway entered adolescence quietly, almost unnoticed, the same way he drifted through childhood. Yet, beneath that ordinary exterior, something was shifting. Something subtle. Something that did not announce itself with outbursts or drama, but moved quietly, like a tide rising in the dark. The suburbs of Seattle in the 1960s were calm on the surface. Families gathered for barbecues, kids rode their bikes down long sidewalks, and the sky carried the familiar gray wash of the Pacific Northwest. It was a place where people felt safe enough to leave their doors unlocked, a place that encouraged the belief that danger lived far away. But in Gary's home, that sense of safety never fully took root. His father brought the frustrations of work home with him, often talking about the darker corners of the city, the crimes he overheard as a bus driver, the fights, the arrests, the people he picked up who carried trouble in their eyes. Gary listened quietly, absorbing details without reacting. He didn't ask questions. He didn't express fear. He simply listened, letting those stories sink into him like background noise. His mother, meanwhile, continued to dominate the household with her sharpness. Arguments flared over chores, grades, and imagined slights. She was meticulous, intense, and deeply emotional in ways Gary did not know how to respond to. Sometimes she would chastise him harshly, then pivot into displays of affection that felt confusing and overwhelming. Gary grew up caught in that push and pull, affection that felt smothering, anger that felt unpredictable. This unstable emotional environment shaped his understanding of human connection. It taught him that closeness came with complications, that comfort could turn into humiliation without warning, and that the safest emotional position was often distance. As he grew older, something else began to define him. A deep, quiet sense of powerlessness. He was small for his age, academically behind, socially awkward. Other boys developed swagger, Gary developed silence. Other boys learned confidence, Gary learned how to disappear into the background. Whenever he felt overwhelmed, he withdrew, letting the world move around him while he sank deeper into his internal shell. But inside that shell, something else brewed: resentment, confusion, and a slow-burning frustration he didn't know how to express. Teachers noticed he was becoming more disconnected. His gaze would drift off during lessons, unfocused and vacant. When other students joked, he struggled to understand the humor. When they teased him, he absorbed it without defending himself. And when emotional conflicts emerged, even small ones, he seemed unsure of how to react. This lack of emotional development didn't make him outwardly threatening. In fact, it made him seem even more harmless. Adults described him as odd but sweet. Kids described him as quiet but weird. He didn't fight. He didn't argue. He didn't disrupt class. He simply existed on the edges. But adolescence introduced something new. A fascination with control. Not in a dramatic, cinematic way, but in subtle moments. Moments when he realized he could influence a situation simply by being still. Moments when he learned that silence could be a tool. Moments when he discovered the strange satisfaction of watching others react while he remained unreadable. These were small things, barely noticeable, but they hinted at an internal shift. He was beginning to understand people not emotionally, but strategically, how they moved, what they responded to, what they expected. He learned how to mimic social behavior enough to appear to fit in, even if he didn't truly connect. Outside of school, his world grew even narrower. He spent long hours walking alone, exploring wooded areas and abandoned lots near his neighborhood. These places offered him something he struggled to find elsewhere: quiet, isolation, and a sense of control over his surroundings. In the woods, he didn't feel inferior. He didn't feel watched or judged. He simply moved freely, without expectations. Neighbors occasionally saw him wandering and assumed he was simply a shy, introverted kid. Some offered him small jobs or invited him to help with yard work. He accepted, grateful for the distraction, but rarely spoke more than necessary. He remained a mystery to those around him, harmless, polite, but somehow unknowable. As he entered high school, Gary began to change physically, growing taller and stronger. But his emotional development remained stuck in earlier stages. He struggled to express affection, form friendships, or understand the emotional needs of others. When he dated, his relationships were shallow and awkward, marked by confusion more than connection. He imitated what he saw others do, following the motions without truly feeling them. This emotional immaturity didn't stand out dramatically. He wasn't a loner in the cinematic sense, no menace, no outbursts, no dramatic warnings. He was simply lost, drifting through adolescence without anchoring to anything meaningful. But beneath that lostness lived something dangerous. A disconnect between emotion and consequence. He didn't process guilt the way others did. He didn't internalize empathy the way others learned to. He didn't develop strong emotional bonds, even with people who cared about him. This didn't make him violent, not yet, but it created the perfect psychological environment for future harm. Harm that he wouldn't fully understand or feel the weight of. Harm that would grow quietly, unnoticed. High school teachers described him as polite but strange, cooperative but distant, and unable to grasp nuance or complex emotions. One teacher later said that talking to him felt like speaking through a fog, as if he understood the words but not the meaning behind them. By the time he graduated, Gary Ridgway was emotionally stunted, socially distant, and quietly simmering with feelings he could not express or define. He didn't explode. He didn't rebel. He didn't show warning signs in the traditional sense. Instead, he left high school the same way he entered it. Quiet, unnoticed, and carrying shadows that no one had ever fully seen. As he stepped into adulthood, two sides of him began to form. The calm, compliant young man everyone knew. And a deeper, darker part of him that felt nothing, feared nothing. And was slowly waiting to awaken. And soon, that awakening would begin. Not with violence. But with choices that seemed small at first. Choices that would eventually lead him toward a path the world would never forget. Chapter 3, The First Shades of Darkness. When Gary Ridgway stepped into adulthood, he carried the same quietness that defined his childhood, a still, muted presence that made him difficult to read and easy to overlook. But adulthood introduced new pressures, responsibility, independence, relationships, and the invisible expectations that come with them. For most young men, these changes are challenging but manageable. For someone like Gary, they were overwhelming. After high school, he drifted into the working world with little direction. He took whatever jobs were available, janitorial work, part-time labor, anything that paid enough to get by. He showed up on time, worked steadily, and rarely complained. Employers described him as dependable, but not memorable. He did what was asked and never more. There was no ambition, no curiosity about advancement, no desire to stand out. Gary seemed content with simplicity, with repetition, with the quiet predictability of routine. This predictability comforted him. In routine, he didn't have to navigate complicated emotions or social expectations. He simply followed instructions, completed tasks, and retreated to the stillness of his own mind. He lived like a shadow, present, but not fully engaged. But inside him, the emotional void that had formed throughout his childhood was beginning to evolve. He felt frustration more easily. He struggled to articulate his needs. And despite appearing calm, a simmering instability lurked under the surface, subtle, but growing. Relationships became the pressure point where these cracks first appeared. In his early adulthood, Gary began dating more seriously. On the surface, he seemed ready for marriage, ready to build a stable life. He wanted companionship, a sense of normalcy, and the image of being a committed husband. But emotionally, he was unequipped for intimacy. He didn't understand affection, didn't communicate well, and struggled to empathize with the needs of a partner. Still, he married young, holding on to the hope that marriage would give him the identity he lacked, the emotional structure he never developed. His first marriage came with brief moments of peace, but underneath, the same emotional detachment that defined him from childhood seeped into every interaction. Arguments confused him. Expectations overwhelmed him. He responded to conflict the only way he knew how: silence. But silence, when shared with another person, can feel like a void. His wife sensed the distance, the lack of emotional reciprocity, the sense that Gary was present physically but absent mentally. She described him as cold, unreachable, and emotionally flat. And over time, the marriage deteriorated under the strain of disconnect. It wasn't just emotional distance that strained the relationship. Gary's insecurities deepened. He began experiencing profound jealousy, often without cause. His lack of emotional regulation made small misunderstandings feel monumental. His wife recalled moments where he seemed lost in his own frustration, not aggressive, but intensely confused, as if trying to decode emotions he couldn't comprehend. As the marriage fell apart, Gary struggled to cope. Divorce wasn't just a loss, it felt like a failure he didn't understand but couldn't escape. And yet, instead of processing it, he buried the emotional turmoil inside the same quiet shell he'd lived in since childhood. After the divorce, he sought stability again through connection, remarrying not long after. His second marriage began similarly, hopeful, calm, and structured. He provided financially, maintained routines, and tried to fill the role of a responsible partner. But while he adopted the appearance of normalcy, his internal world continued to deteriorate. This time, the cracks showed more clearly. He became more isolated, spending long hours walking alone, disappearing for stretches of time without clear explanations. His wife noticed the emotional absence. She sensed angry undercurrents that he never verbalized and moods that shifted unpredictably. He wasn't violent in the cinematic sense, no loud threats, no dramatic scenes, but his emotional instability made the relationship uneven and frightening in quieter ways. It was as though he lived behind a wall she could never penetrate. Friends described him as odd but harmless, distant but polite, and strange, but never threatening. The truth is, no one looked closely enough to see the deeper shift happening inside him, a shift from emotional detachment to emotional numbness. And numbness, when left unchallenged, creates space for impulses that would disturb most people deeply but barely register for someone who lacks emotional wiring. During this period, Gary joined the Navy. His military years were brief and relatively uneventful, but they revealed something crucial: he struggled significantly with emotional stability under stress. While other recruits adapted to discipline, hierarchy, and camaraderie, Gary remained withdrawn. He performed his duties but formed no meaningful bonds. He drifted through service the same way he drifted through school, present, but detached. When he returned home, he carried with him the same emotional void, but now it had deepened. He was in his early 20s, but emotionally he felt far younger, and far more unstable. He wanted relationships but couldn't maintain them. He wanted identity but couldn't form it. And beneath it all, he felt a rising frustration with life he couldn't name or describe. It was during these post-military years that the earliest, faintest signs of darker impulses began to appear. Observers wouldn't have recognized them as warnings, they seemed like quirks, odd habits, moments of intensity that quickly passed. But for Gary, they were the beginning of an internal shift that would eventually spiral into something far more dangerous. He began testing boundaries, not in dramatic ways, but in subtle experiments of control. He grew fixated on situations where he felt powerful or dominant. He watched people closely, not emotionally, but analytically. He became more controlling in relationships, seeking predictability through authority rather than connection. These patterns didn't erupt suddenly, they tightened slowly, quietly, until they became part of his identity. His second marriage followed the same trajectory as the first: brief stability, emotional deterioration, and eventual collapse. But this time, the end of the marriage didn't leave him confused. It left him untethered. And for a man with no internal compass, no emotional foundation, and no stable identity, that lack of grounding became the beginning of something far more concerning. As he entered his mid-twenties, Gary Ridgway was a man divided. To the outside world, he was quiet, polite, dependable. Inside, he was becoming something else, disconnected from empathy, increasingly resentful, and growing curious about the power he lacked throughout his life. These were the first shades of darkness, faint, quiet, hard to notice, but unmistakable once examined in hindsight. And soon, life would offer him the environment where those shadows could grow freely. A new job, a new neighborhood, and a new level of anonymity. The perfect conditions for his hidden darkness to evolve. Chapter 4: Becoming the quiet neighbor. By the time Gary Ridgway entered his late 20s, he had settled into a rhythm that felt almost comfortable. Not happy, not fulfilled, just familiar. He worked steady jobs, mostly in paint shops or factory environments where instructions were clear and expectations small. He didn't complain, didn't argue, and didn't challenge authority. He did what he was told and disappeared into the background. And that ability, to blend, to quiet himself, to avoid scrutiny, would soon become the most dangerous part of who he was. After the turbulence of his early relationships, he moved into a modest home in King County, Washington, a place shaded by tall pines and framed by the constant mist of the Pacific Northwest. The neighborhood was ordinary in every sense. Children rode bikes through cul-de-sacs. Dogs barked from fenced yards. Neighbors waved from driveways. It was the kind of place where nobody expected secrets, especially secrets that hid behind the eyes of a man who barely stood out at all. To the people around him, Gary was almost painfully normal. He kept his yard tidy. He drove an unremarkable pickup truck. He nodded politely when neighbors passed by. He didn't drink heavily, didn't host loud parties, didn't cause trouble. If anything, he seemed too quiet, polite to a fault, soft-spoken, almost shy. But in a community where people valued peaceful routines, quiet was considered a virtue, not a warning sign. Co-workers described him the same way: dependable, introverted, and oddly emotionless. He showed up early, worked long hours, and rarely took sick days. He wasn't charismatic or friendly, but he wasn't rude either. He existed in that strange middle space where people form no strong opinions at all. They simply accept the presence of someone who appears harmless. That harmlessness, however, was carefully curated. Whether consciously or instinctively, Gary learned to adopt the behaviors that kept him invisible. He avoided confrontation. He spoke in short, simple sentences. He kept his head down. He adapted to expectations rather than expressing his own. It was a survival mechanism, the same one he had used throughout his childhood, and now it shielded him from attention in adulthood. Inside his home, life was equally quiet. He kept his belongings organized, almost obsessively neat, as if creating order on the outside could soothe the growing disarray within him. He purchased items second-hand, kept old magazines stacked neatly in boxes, and maintained routines that comforted him: the same foods, the same routes to work, the same predictable patterns day after day. Routine gave him control. Control gave him calm. Calm gave him stability, the only stability he ever knew how to hold. It was around this time that Gary began exploring religion more seriously. He attended church regularly, sometimes reading scripture aloud in a flat, almost mechanical tone. He wasn't passionate or emotional about faith. Instead, he seemed drawn to the structure of it, the rules, the clear expectations, the reinforcement of discipline. His fellow congregants saw him as shy but sincere. They assumed his quiet demeanor was humility, not emotional detachment. He joined Bible study groups, volunteered occasionally, and presented himself as a man trying to live a better life. In many ways, he believed he was. Religion offered him a sense of identity he never developed internally. It gave him words he didn't fully understand but found comfort repeating. It filled the silent spaces in his mind with something that felt stable, even if he couldn't interpret the deeper meaning behind it. And yet, even with these outward signs of normalcy, the emotional void inside him only grew. Gary didn't feel connected to the people he worshipped with. He didn't feel spiritually moved or morally anchored. He felt managed, controlled, held together by walls he built around himself, not by genuine emotional grounding. Neighbors who lived close to him noticed oddities, nothing dramatic, just small, unsettling details. He seemed obsessive about certain tasks, mowing his lawn with meticulous precision, cleaning his truck repeatedly, or standing outside his house for long periods with a blank, distant stare. Some found him strange. Most didn't think about him at all. And that was exactly the point. Gary learned how to behave in ways that made people overlook him. Not charming enough to draw attention. Not aggressive enough to raise suspicion. Not social enough to build connections. Just quiet enough to fade into the background of everyone's life. This invisibility extended to his second marriage, which began crumbling under the weight of his emotional detachment. He continued to mimic normal partner behavior, attending church with his wife, maintaining a job, managing bills, but lacked the emotional depth needed for true intimacy. His wife often felt alone even when he was sitting beside her. She described him later as robotic, hollow, and impossible to read. Arguments were rare, not because the marriage was peaceful, but because Gary didn't express anger outwardly. His emotions remained locked inside, silent and unexamined. But silence doesn't erase frustration, it only buries it. And buried emotions often resurface in distorted, dangerous ways. During this period, his behavior began shifting in subtle but noticeable patterns. He grew more controlling, more isolated, more obsessive about routines. He spent increasing amounts of time driving alone late at night, walking near wooded areas, and lingering in places where vulnerable people gathered. At first, these activities seemed harmless, the habits of a man who preferred solitude. But they were, in fact, the earliest structural pieces of something darker forming, a pattern of movement, observation, and internal rehearsal. His job offered him a perfect cover. He worked long hours painting trucks, breathing in the chemical fumes he claimed never bothered him. The work environment was loud, chaotic, and filled with coworkers who kept to themselves. Nobody paid much attention to Gary as long as he completed his tasks. He could go unnoticed for hours at a time, even while standing in the same room as others. And outside of work, he existed in a kind of social fog, someone people recognized, but didn't really see. He showed polite friendliness when necessary, but offered no warmth, no personality, no glimpse into his inner world. This strange neutrality made him trustworthy in the eyes of strangers. Harmless. Safe. A man who could never possibly be the source of fear or danger. He didn't appear driven by anger or chaos. He appeared steady. Predictable. Comfortably forgettable. And that identity, the quiet neighbor, the calm worker, the gentle churchgoer, was becoming a mask so complete that even he began to believe in it. But behind that mask, the emotional numbness that shaped his childhood had blended with the growing frustrations of adulthood. His marriages had failed. His relationships were hollow. He drifted through life without connection or fulfillment. And beneath that drifting calm, impulses were forming quietly, impulses he didn't fully understand, but would soon be unable to ignore. By the late 1970s, Gary Ridgway had mastered the art of appearing normal. Too normal. The kind of normal that protects a man from suspicion. The kind of normal that lets a shadow pass through a community unnoticed. He was the neighbor people waved to, but never really knew. The coworker people trusted, but never questioned. The man who blended into the background of every room he entered. And soon, behind that ordinary face, a new identity would begin to take shape. Chapter 5, The Green River Begins to Whisper. By the early 1980s, the Pacific Northwest had settled into its familiar rhythm. The rain came and went like breathing. The mornings were cool and misty. The nights were quiet, softened by the hum of distant traffic and the gentle sway of trees. Nothing about the region suggested danger. Nothing hinted that one of the darkest chapters in American criminal history was about to begin. For Gary Ridgway, life seemed stable on the surface. He was working steadily, attending church, maintaining his routines, and living behind the facade he built so carefully. But beneath that surface, the fracture in his emotional world had widened. He felt increasingly disconnected from his second marriage, drifting through daily life with the same numbness that had shadowed him since childhood. He went through the motions, working, eating, sleeping, but there was no emotional anchor, no sense of purpose or fulfillment. This growing emptiness created space for darker impulses to take hold. He found himself spending more time alone, driving aimlessly through suburban roads and rural backroutes late at night. The wooded areas, once places of quiet comfort, began to take on a different meaning. He felt drawn to them, not for peace, but for the sense of isolation they offered. They were places where no one watched him, places where he could move like a ghost. Meanwhile, in the larger world around him, subtle changes were occurring, shifts in the fabric of the community that few noticed at first. Streets that had once felt safe at night began to feel uneasy. Not because anything had happened yet, but because people who lived on the margins of society were beginning to disappear. The first cases were small enough to slip through the cracks. A young woman who didn't come home. A teenager who vanished after leaving a friend's house. A woman last seen hitchhiking along a busy highway. These stories rarely made the evening news, and when they did, they were brief, 2 sentences, a photograph, a plea from family members hoping someone had seen something. In the early weeks, law enforcement didn't see a pattern. The disappearances were scattered across King County, with nothing linking them except the victim's vulnerability. Most were young women living unstable lives, some struggling with poverty, addiction, or homelessness. Many had left home voluntarily or traveled frequently, making timelines uncertain. Police assumed they had moved on, relocated, or simply fallen out of contact with loved ones. It wasn't unusual for people on the margins to slip through the seams of society. But in the spaces between those assumptions, the first whispers of a pattern were forming, faint, fragile, and easy to dismiss. Meanwhile, Ridgway's own behavior began shifting in unsettling ways, though still too subtle for those around him to grasp. He became more controlling in relationships, more detached at work, more emotionally hollow in everyday interactions. He started showing up late for shifts without explanation, or returning home at odd hours. Neighbors noticed he was gone more often than usual. But because he remained polite, quiet, and seemingly responsible, no one considered these changes a red flag. People often misjudge danger when it comes in calm packaging. During this period, Ridgway gravitated toward areas of the city where vulnerable people gathered, bus stops, highways, night streets lit by flickering lamps. He didn't appear threatening. He didn't yell or intimidate. He approached people the same way he approached everyone else, with that quiet tone, that soft expression, that disarming ordinariness. People who might have avoided louder Angrier men didn't feel the need to avoid him. That quietness was becoming a mask he was no longer just wearing, it was becoming who he believed himself to be. And then, on a warm summer day in 1982, everything changed. Two young boys were walking along a shallow stretch of the Green River, a slow-moving body of water bordered by reeds and drifting logs. They weren't looking for anything, just exploring the edges of the river the way kids do, kicking stones and poking sticks into the mud. The water was calm, carrying the reflection of the sky in soft blue ripples. And then they saw something. Something that shouldn't have been there. They ran home immediately, breathless and terrified. Their parents called the police. And the investigation that followed marked the beginning of one of the most extensive serial murder cases the United States would ever face. The discovery sent a ripple through the community, though at first, the shock was small, contained within the crime scene and a short news segment read by a local anchor. But within days, a second discovery surfaced along the river. Then a third. Then a fourth. Each one eroded the illusion of safety that the region had quietly held onto for decades. For the first time, detectives began to whisper the possibility they had hoped to avoid. Someone was hunting vulnerable women. Someone who knew the roads, the patterns, the blind spots. Someone who moved quietly and understood how to vanish without a trace. Those early investigations were chaotic. There were too many possibilities, too few leads, and a growing sense of unease among law enforcement. Detectives canvassed the area, interviewed families, spoke to witnesses, and created timelines that fell apart almost immediately. The victims weren't connected by friendships or neighborhoods. They didn't know one another. They weren't taken from the same areas. But they shared one vulnerability: they were young women living unstable lives, often without stable support networks. That isolation made them easy targets, and easy to overlook when they disappeared. Detectives began gathering details, trying desperately to piece together a pattern. Some remembered seeing a dark-colored pickup truck in the area. Others described a man who approached women with a polite demeanor, offering rides or conversation. None of the descriptions matched the stereotype of a violent predator. Instead, they described someone normal, quiet, unthreatening. Someone who could pass unnoticed in any environment. Someone like Gary Ridgway, though at this stage, no one had connected his name to anything yet. Meanwhile, Ridgway continued living his double life with ease. He went to work. He paid bills. He attended church. He engaged in small talk with neighbors. He maintained the quiet routines that made him blend in flawlessly. No one suspected the man who smiled shyly and kept to himself. No one questioned the neighbor who never caused trouble. No one thought that a man so ordinary could be responsible for something so extraordinary in its cruelty. In a community rooted in trust, appearance carried enormous weight. Ridgway's appearance, calm, soft, compliant, became his camouflage. As weeks passed, whispers turned into fear. Parents warned their daughters not to accept rides from strangers. Patrol cars circulated with increased frequency. The Green River, once just another calm stretch of water, became a symbol of dread. People avoided it. They avoided walking alone. They avoided the areas where disappearances had occurred. Yet, even as fear grew, Ridgway remained unnoticed. A bland patch in the fabric of the community. A man whose face no one remembered clearly. Whose presence blended into the soft hum of daily life. And as law enforcement worked tirelessly to understand the pattern forming around them, Ridgway watched from a distance, unnoticed, unremarkable, untouched by suspicion. The Green River had begun to whisper. But no one yet understood the message. And the man at the center of it would remain invisible a little longer. Silent. Ordinary. And more dangerous than anyone could yet imagine. That ordinariness allowed him to stand inches from detection without ever being truly seen. Even as detectives referred to the unknown suspect as the Green River Killer, even as the case widened into one of the largest serial investigations in American history, Ridgway remained the same man his neighbors described as the quiet one. The killer investigators imagined was impulsive, unstable, someone whose presence created unease. Ridgway, with his shy demeanor and steady job, fit none of these assumptions. He walked through grocery stores unnoticed. He paused at gas stations without suspicion. He sat in church pews beside families who believed they were safe. Every part of his outward life made him the last person anyone would connect to what was happening along the river. And so, as law enforcement tightened their focus and the public braced for answers, the real killer drifted calmly through daily life, anonymous, forgettable, practically invisible. The Green River Killer was becoming a shadow that stretched across Seattle's consciousness, whispered about in homes, workplaces, and late-night conversations. But the man behind that shadow remained undetected, moving through the world with a silence so complete that it hid everything he truly was. He didn't need to run. He didn't need to lie dramatically. He simply blended, because blending was what he had mastered since childhood. And as investigators searched for a monster, they overlooked the man who never stood out, never raised his voice, never left a strong impression. Gary Ridgway was not the villain people pictured. He was the quiet presence in the corner of every room you never looked at twice. And while the city trembled at the thought of a faceless killer, that face, ordinary, calm, unremarkable, walked freely among them, unnoticed. Chapter 8, Patterns in the Water, A City Begins to Understand. By the middle of 1983, the Green River investigation had grown into something much larger than a missing persons case. It had become a puzzle stretching across miles of forest, riverbank, and forgotten roadside spaces, leaving detectives exhausted, the public terrified, and the city trapped between hope for answers and fear of what those answers might reveal. For months, bodies had been discovered in clusters, some close enough to one another that investigators grew almost certain they were looking for a single individual, someone who knew the backroads with an almost instinctual familiarity. Yet the closer they examined the physical locations, the more confusing the picture became. There were footprints but no clear suspects, tire marks that matched common vehicles, and witness statements describing a man so ordinary he could have been anyone passing through Seattle. In their briefing rooms, detectives began mapping the timelines, placing pushpins into large county maps and connecting them with lengths of string that wove across the board like a web of unanswered questions. They held meetings late into the night, drinking stale coffee and flipping through manila folders, hoping that some overlooked detail would suddenly make a pattern obvious. And as they worked, the city outside shifted with a growing sense of unease. Parents reminded children not to walk alone, young women avoided certain highways, and headlines filled with speculation made people anxiously scan the faces of strangers in grocery store lines. Yet even as fear spread, the reality of the situation remained painfully clear. The killer was still out there, moving unnoticed through the community. Meanwhile, Gary Ridgway lived his daily life with the same quiet consistency that had always defined him, unaware, or perhaps unfazed, by the fact that detectives had begun circling the truth. His co-workers still saw him as predictable, offering short nods and faint smiles during long shifts at the truck painting plant, never complaining, never attracting attention. To those who lived near him, he remained the man who simply blended into the landscape, the neighbor who kept his yard tidy, the churchgoer who sat silently in the back pew, the man who waved politely but rarely spoke. This ordinariness made him nearly impossible to suspect. Detectives did not search for a man who resembled an everyday commuter, someone who drove a common pickup truck and lived in a modest home. They were imagining someone chaotic, someone explosive, someone who looked dangerous on sight, another misconception that allowed Ridgway to walk comfortably through the cracks in their investigation. At the same time, the women living on the margins of Seattle, those most at risk, felt the tension deeply. They warned one another of strange encounters, avoided certain spots after dark, and clung to groups when possible. Some reported conversations with a soft-spoken man driving a pickup truck, a man whose demeanor didn't seem threatening but whose presence lingered uneasily in their memories. Police took statements, but the descriptions varied widely: average, quiet voice, brown hair, nothing unusual. Nothing in these details pointed directly to Ridgway. He was simply too plain to stand out. Meanwhile, law enforcement attempted to leverage early profiling methods, bringing in experts who studied the emerging pattern. These profilers suggested that the killer was likely a local, someone familiar with the region's geography, someone who blended into the community without drawing suspicion. They believed he was organized, methodical, living an otherwise stable life, someone who would seem calm, even friendly, if approached. This description fit Ridgway perfectly, yet his name remained buried among hundreds of others in overstuffed case files. As the police struggled, the public began forming theories of their own. Some believed the killer was a trucker moving through the area, others suspected someone working night shifts in industrial zones, and still others believed it was a drifter who slipped across state lines. But no one considered that the man might be living a quiet suburban life only minutes away from the investigation headquarters. Ridgway wasn't watching the investigation with nervous curiosity, he was absorbing it with the same flat calm he brought to everything. The news reports didn't startle him, the press conferences didn't make him hesitate. He simply went on with his routines, maintaining the exact kind of consistency that made him invisible. And as detectives grew more desperate, the number of missing women continued to rise, each disappearance sending another wave of fear through communities already drowning in uncertainty. The forests around the city, once seen as peaceful retreats, became ominous expanses filled with dread. The river, once a symbol of the region's natural beauty, now carried an entirely different weight. Night workers kept keys gripped tightly between their fingers, mothers slept lightly, listening for their daughters' footsteps returning home. Every corner felt heavier. Every stranger felt suspect. Every stretch of road seemed like it could hold a secret. Throughout all of this, Ridgway remained steady. He went to work, kept to his routines, drove his truck through rain-drenched streets, and moved with the same deliberate quietness that defined his entire life. His emotional detachment, rooted in childhood, shaped across years of shallow relationships, allowed him to mimic normalcy better than most people could perform sincerity. Nothing about him revealed tension or panic. He did not fit the image of a predator in anyone's imagination. That disconnect protected him repeatedly, shielding him from deeper scrutiny even when investigators brushed against his name. And so, while detectives tried to weave together the patterns scattered across maps and interviews, Gary Ridgway remained the one piece that never quite fit into their theories, because he looked like a man no one would expect, living a life no one thought to question. By the end of 1983, the term Green River Killer had fully entered public conversation, whispered in fear at dinner tables and spoken in frustration by detectives. The identity of the killer remained a blank space, a phantom silhouette shaped by fear rather than certainty. The city watched, waited, and braced for answers. But the man behind the terror remained unremarkable, unnoticed, and unimagined. He walked through the world hidden by simplicity itself, the kind of dangerous invisibility that only a truly ordinary face could create. And while the Green River whispered its terrible pattern louder each month, the quiet man responsible for it all continued living comfortably in the blind spot of a city trying desperately to understand the darkness closing in around it. Chapter 9, The Invisible Threat, A City Searches for a Ghost. By early 1984, the Green River Task Force had grown into the largest investigative operation in Washington state's history, filling entire floors of office buildings with stacks of files, maps riddled with colored pins, and exhausted detectives who worked under the weight of expectations they could feel in every press briefing and every late-night phone call. Yet despite their tireless efforts, the suspect at the center of it all remained as intangible as fog drifting across the riverbanks. A presence they could sense in the emerging patterns but couldn't attach to any single name. Meanwhile, the city around them lived in a state of uneasy vigilance, with parents reminding daughters to call home, workers traveling in pairs, and neighborhoods exchanging whispers about the possibility that the killer might be someone local, someone ordinary, someone blending into the very fabric of their daily routines. The pressure intensified as more cases appeared on investigators' desks, each one knitting another thread into an ever-expanding puzzle that refused to align cleanly, and although the task force refined their methods and improved communication between departments, the culprit's identity remained a blank silhouette on the board, a faceless figure moving through Seattle with deliberate calm. As detectives struggled to create a coherent profile, various theories emerged. Some believed the killer was an impulsive drifter, others argued he was someone intelligent and meticulous, and still others suggested he might be hiding a double life behind a facade of neighborly normalcy. These differing theories, though well-intentioned, created friction within the task force. Resources were stretched thin as they followed leads in multiple directions, often running into dead ends that left investigators frustrated, fatigued, and increasingly aware that whoever they pursued was watching the investigation unfold without, leaving behind the kinds of errors law enforcement depended on to break cases open. And while the case grew more complex, Gary Ridgway's life remained astonishingly steady. He arrived at work on time, handled routine tasks with predictable consistency, and maintained a bland politeness that ensured he was forgettable even to those who interacted with him daily. His emotional detachment, long a defining trait, shielded him from the pressure an average person would have felt as the investigation intensified around him. He did not display nervousness, did not shift his patterns abruptly, did not behave in ways that would raise red flags, and so he existed in a pocket of invisibility even as detectives unknowingly crossed paths with the truth. At home, Ridgway continued to build the appearance of stability. He managed his finances carefully, maintained his house and yard with disciplined regularity, and participated in church groups often enough to be recognized but not enough to stand out, keeping his interactions shallow but polite. To neighbors, he was simply that quiet man, the one who waved from a distance, kept to himself, and never caused any trouble, and in communities accustomed to associating danger with aggression or chaos, someone so mild did not register as a threat. Meanwhile, many of the young women at risk became increasingly aware of the rumors surrounding the disappearances. Talk spread along the streets where they lived and worked, stories passed from one person to the next about a quiet man offering rides, a man driving a pickup truck, a man whose gentle tone didn't quite match the uneasy feeling he sometimes left behind. Some avoided him. Some didn't. But nearly all described him as someone who didn't look dangerous, a man whose presence felt more peculiar than alarming. Law enforcement, overwhelmed by interviews, began filing these stories into a growing database, but because the descriptions were vague, dark hair, average height, soft voice, they could not isolate a specific suspect. Even when Ridgway's name appeared in reports, it was accompanied by phrases like, "nothing unusual," or "cooperative" during questioning, and so he slipped back into the shadows with astonishing ease. At this point, the task force began pushing for new tactics, realizing that traditional policing alone would not solve a case so diffuse and layered. They consulted psychologists, geographic profilers, and forensic experts to help identify patterns invisible to the human eye. Computers, still primitive compared to today, were used to compare case details, though the technology lacked the sophistication needed to draw meaningful connections. Still, despite the limitations, a faint outline of the killer's habits began to form. He was likely a local, familiar with wooded areas and secluded stretches of road. He seemed methodical, controlled, and confident enough to revisit locations, and he appeared to select victims based not on specific individuals but on opportunity and vulnerability. This early profile matched Ridgway perfectly, yet because he was so quiet, so nondescript, so painfully ordinary, he remained buried beneath hundreds of other names, an overlooked possibility in a sea of louder suspects. And as the investigation intensified, fear seeped deeper into the community. The forests surrounding the Green River area, once places where families hiked and teenagers gathered after school, now felt haunted by the unknown. Women were advised not to walk alone, bus drivers reported suspicious interactions, local newspapers printed articles warning people to remain vigilant. The Green River Killer had become more than a threat, he had become a presence, a shadow cast across the entire region, altering routines and shaping behaviors in subtle but powerful ways. Yet through it all, Ridgway continued living his double life without hesitation. He attended family gatherings, exchanged small talk with coworkers, and navigated his days with the same blank calm that defined him since childhood. He watched news coverage with a kind of emotional distance that baffled even those closest to him. He showed no outward signs of anxiety, even when reporters stood at the very locations investigators now believed were connected to the killer. This capacity to remain emotionally flat under pressure was one of the most dangerous aspects of his personality, because it allowed him to appear innocent even when surrounded by the consequences of his actions. Meanwhile, detectives continued pulling on every thread available, some leading to promising leads while others dissolved the moment they were tugged. They followed up on tips, conducted surveillance operations, collaborated with federal agencies, and attempted to narrow the list of suspects, but the lack of direct evidence made progress painfully slow. Every discovery felt like a step forward, only to be followed by another setback. And with each setback, frustration grew. The city, impatient for answers, pressured the task force relentlessly, demanding explanations the detectives did not yet have. Still, they persisted, driven by a combination of duty, determination, and the hope that one missing piece would eventually fall into place. What they didn't realize was that one of those missing pieces lived only a short distance away, mowing his lawn in the evenings, reading the newspaper at his kitchen table, driving to work before sunrise, slipping through their checkpoints unnoticed. Ridgway's ability to blend into the ordinary world so effortlessly kept him far from suspicion during these crucial early years of the investigation. And as the task force fought to illuminate the killer's identity, Ridgway remained the ghost in their periphery, a man hiding behind the illusion of normalcy so completely that his presence slipped between the cracks of every theory, every profile, every list of potential suspects. By the end of 1984, the Green River Killer had become a name that carried weight, fear, and frustration in equal measure. The city had accepted the reality that the threat was not temporary but ongoing. Detectives had accepted that the case would not be solved easily. Families of missing women had accepted that answers might come slowly, if at all. And through it all, the man responsible continued living quietly among them, the ordinary face behind the extraordinary fear, a figure so unremarkable that even those searching for him directly could not see him clearly. He was the ghost of Seattle's streets, the invisible threat woven into everyday life, and for the moment, he remained untouchable. Chapter 10, The Net Tightens, but not enough. By early 1985, the Green River Task Force had grown into a massive operation, its headquarters buzzing day and night with detectives, analysts, clerks, and volunteers, all surrounded by towering stacks of case files that seemed to multiply faster than anyone could process, creating a sense of urgency that permeated every conversation and every dimly lit office inside the department. Despite the sheer volume of work, the sense of progress remained painfully limited, and each time another body was found or another woman reported missing, the weight pressing down on the task force grew heavier, fueling a mixture of frustration and determination that kept investigators moving long after exhaustion set in. They knew the killer was still out there, navigating the same streets and wooded areas they were patrolling, slipping through their checkpoints and interviews with a calmness that made him nearly impossible to detect. And while detectives debated theories, reviewed maps, and compared notes late into the night, Gary Ridgway continued living a life so normal and predictable that it never occurred to anyone he could be the quiet storm behind the chaos. His co-workers saw him as reliable, a man who followed instructions precisely and rarely spoke unless spoken to, and though some noticed odd habits, his flat emotional tone, his rigid routines, the way he seemed disconnected from conversations, none of these traits aligned with the mental image of a predator that even seasoned investigators carried. In the 1980s, the stereotype of a serial killer was someone erratic, dramatic, visibly unstable. Ridgway, with his soft voice and blank expression, appeared more like an overly shy neighbor than a dangerous figure. Meanwhile, detectives began expanding their methods, incorporating geographic profiling to determine where the killer might live or work. They studied dump sites, looking for patterns in terrain, accessibility, and timing. They charted distances between locations, theorizing that the killer lived somewhere central, close enough to revisit certain areas, far enough to feel comfortable transporting victims without risk. These early geographic analyses actually placed the killer within a small radius that included Ridgway's home, but because he left no compelling trail pointing directly toward him, his name remained buried in the middle of long lists of possible suspects. At the same time, law enforcement began interviewing hundreds of men, truck drivers, night shift workers, taxi drivers, construction workers, delivery employees, anyone whose routine gave them reasons to be in the same areas as the missing women. Ridgway was among them. When his turn came, detectives noted that he was calm, cooperative, and almost uncomfortably polite. He answered questions without hesitation, offered alibis that sounded routine rather than rehearsed, and displayed none of the nervousness investigators were trained to look for. His emotional flatness was misread as innocence, because in that era, people expected guilt to show itself. They expected trembling hands, shifting eyes, stammering voices. Ridgway had none of those. He had nearly perfected the art of neutrality, something he had done unknowingly since childhood as a means of survival. Meanwhile, the community outside grew increasingly anxious. Public meetings were held where parents begged for safety measures, activists demanded increased resources for vulnerable populations, and women shared stories of frightening encounters that seemed connected, though often the details were too vague to prove anything. Flyers filled telephone poles. Newspapers published editorials about the fear shadowing the region. Talk shows invited experts to speculate about the killer's psychology, creating images of a monstrous figure who bore no resemblance to the quiet man sitting at his kitchen table eating leftovers after work. Some nights, the phone lines for the tip center rang non-stop, people calling about suspicious neighbors, co-workers, strangers they saw near highways. The task force chased these leads, sometimes staying awake for days at a time, only to discover most were misunderstandings, coincidences, or unrelated crimes. Yet among the thousands of tips were a handful involving Ridgway, none urgent, none specific, none strong enough to pull him into the spotlight. Each time, detectives dismissed him with a few words: cooperative. Nothing unusual. Not a priority. Even when an early polygraph test suggested he was telling the truth, investigators placed a checkmark by his name and moved on, unaware that polygraphs are most effective at detecting anxiety, something Ridgway simply did not show. While detectives focused elsewhere, the killer's presence shaped the city in subtle ways. Some neighborhoods organized watch groups. Women traveled in pairs or avoided certain streets entirely. Taxi drivers refused to pick up lone passengers in some areas. Businesses installed brighter lights. Yet the man responsible remained embedded within the very routines people saw as safe: going to work before sunrise, coming home before dinner, keeping conversations short and behaviors predictable. As the investigation intensified, forensic technology lagged behind. DNA testing was in its infancy, fingerprints were unreliable due to environmental damage at river sites, and most physical evidence decayed quickly in water or forest terrain. Investigators relied on hunches, interviews, and psychological profiles, powerful tools, but insufficient against someone who left almost nothing behind. Ridgway, without understanding the science behind it, benefited from the limitations of the era. He wasn't brilliant, but he was cautious, predictable. And his simplicity confused investigators who assumed a killer of such magnitude must be cunning or sophisticated. In truth, Ridgway's most powerful weapon was not intelligence, it was invisibility born from conformity. By late 1985, the task force was under enormous public pressure. The media demanded answers. Families demanded justice. Politicians demanded results. The longer the case dragged on, the more it felt like the killer was taunting the entire region simply by continuing to exist. Yet behind the scenes, detectives were quietly narrowing their focus, even if they didn't yet realize how close they were. They had noticed clusters in geography. They recognized patterns of behavior. They understood that the killer revisited certain areas frequently. And though the suspect list remained long, it was not infinite. The circle tightened slowly. And inside that circle, unnoticed among hundreds of names, sat Gary Ridgway, still mowing his lawn, still working his shifts, still sitting in church pews without anyone suspecting they were feet away from the most prolific serial killer in American history. The task force was approaching him in small, nearly invisible increments. They didn't know it yet. Ridgway certainly didn't fear it. But with every new discovery, every map updated, every suspect re-evaluated, the gap between the investigators and the truth grew thinner. The Green River Killer was no longer just a ghost haunting the region. He was a man whose identity was coming slowly, painfully, into focus. And soon, for the first time, detectives would find themselves standing on the edge of a breakthrough they had spent years chasing, still unaware that the quiet, forgettable man they had long overlooked was right in front of them the entire time. Chapter 11, The Missed Chances. Ridgway slips through their hands. By 1986, the Green River investigation had reached a point where detectives felt they were constantly on the verge of a breakthrough, yet every promising lead evaporated just as quickly as it appeared, leaving the task force in a perpetual state of exhaustion and uncertainty. Dozens of detectives rotated through endless shifts, staring at whiteboards crowded with names, vehicle descriptions, maps, and timelines, trying to connect dots that stubbornly refused to align, and while they worked, the frustration deepened because they sensed, almost instinctively, that they had crossed paths with the killer already, perhaps even spoken to him, shaken his hand, thanked him for cooperating, entirely unaware that the man standing before them had slipped through their filters untouched. One of the most baffling aspects of the case was the sheer number of times investigators came close to Ridgway without realizing the significance of their proximity. They interviewed him briefly, checked his background, even administered a polygraph test after a woman reported an unsettling encounter with him. Each time, he passed through scrutiny with quiet compliance, leaving detectives with the impression of a soft-spoken, socially awkward man who lacked the confidence or charisma they associated with violent offenders. They didn't see the absence of emotion in his eyes because they weren't trained to interpret emptiness as a danger. It simply came across as shyness, or mild discomfort, the kind people exhibit during any police interaction. Even when early behavioral profilers suggested that the killer might be someone who appeared normal, even boring, investigators found it difficult to apply that framework in practice. Humans instinctively look for villains who look like villains, not men whose most defining trait is forgettability. Meanwhile, Ridgway continued living his double life with almost mechanical consistency. He woke early, drove to work through the gray Seattle mornings, performed his tasks at the truck plant with the same repetitive rhythm, and returned home to a quiet house that made no noise and revealed no secrets. His neighbors saw nothing unusual. He kept his yard tidy, greeted others with faint nods, and occasionally attended community events without drawing attention. His wife noticed odd behaviors, distant expressions, unexplained late-night drives, but she interpreted them as marital strain or emotional withdrawal, not as red flags that pointed to anything sinister. The women who survived brief encounters with him struggled to articulate what felt off, because nothing about him was overtly threatening. He wasn't aggressive, didn't raise his voice, didn't touch them without permission. His danger came from his ability to blend completely into whatever environment he entered. In a different era, with modern psychological understanding and advanced forensic tools, Ridgway might have been recognized as a high-risk individual sooner, but in the 1980s, the quiet, compliant man sitting calmly across from detectives simply didn't fit the expected profile. And so, in meeting after meeting, his name slid across tables, glanced over by tired eyes searching for men who seemed capable of physical rage or charismatic manipulation, not someone who looked like a middle-aged, unremarkable worker who kept to himself. As investigators expanded their scope, new technology began to trickle into the task force's toolkit. DNA profiling was in its infancy, primitive, slow, expensive, but promising enough that detectives began saving evidence they hoped might one day yield answers. They collected samples from suspects, stored them properly, and kept meticulous notes on potential matches, even though the odds of getting a definitive result in that decade were slim. Ridgway voluntarily provided a saliva sample, confident that the technology was too new and too limited to expose him. He wasn't wrong. The sample joined dozens of others in evidence freezers, labeled and organized but unable to be analyzed with meaningful precision. Still, the act of collecting it marked a silent turning point, because the day would come when DNA science caught up to the truth. Meanwhile, the task force continued drowning in information. The Green River case had generated a volume of paperwork unlike anything the state had ever seen, and sorting through it became a logistical nightmare. Reports overlapped, statements contradicted each other, and witness memories faded over time. Overworked detectives made mistakes, small errors that seemed insignificant at the time but collectively contributed to missed opportunities. One memo listed Ridgway as a low-priority suspect because of his polite demeanor during questioning. Another flagged him as worth a follow-up, but the detective assigned to the task was transferred before he could make contact. A third report included a woman's account of fleeing his truck in fear, but because she couldn't describe him clearly, investigators filed it under unconfirmed. These accumulated oversights created gaps that Ridgway walked through effortlessly. As the years passed, public pressure mounted. People demanded answers. Media outlets criticized the task force for lacking results. Families of victims attended meetings with tear-streaked faces and trembling hands, begging for any sign of progress. In response, law enforcement expanded the investigation again, bringing in more officers, more analysts, more specialists, yet the core problem remained: the killer's identity was hidden behind normalcy so effectively that even the most seasoned investigators struggled to see beyond their assumptions. Ridgway, meanwhile, felt the growing pressure surrounding the case, but instead of panicking, he adjusted his behavior in subtle ways, avoiding certain areas for a while, limiting his movements, being more cautious but never drastically altering his routine. His predictability was a shield. Any sudden change might have triggered suspicion, but his life remained so mechanically consistent that he never triggered alarms. To those who knew him, he seemed perhaps a bit quieter than usual, but nothing alarming. To investigators, he disappeared into the vast sea of men who lived on the outskirts of a case, present enough to be listed, but not enough to be pursued aggressively. Still, despite all the missed opportunities, the task force wasn't failing. They were circling. Slowly. Painfully. Inevitably. For every oversight, a new piece of information emerged. For every wrong turn, a correct one followed. The radius of possibility tightened, and the number of potential suspects shrank. And though they didn't realize it yet, the men and women working around the clock were inching closer to the truth, narrowing the distance between themselves and the quiet, expressionless man they had spoken to more than once. By 1987, Ridgway was no longer completely invisible within the investigation. His name still wasn't a priority, but it was resurfacing more often than before, appearing in cross-referenced lists, internal reports, and background summaries. The task force was unknowingly grouping him closer and closer to the center of the web. They were on his trail. They were approaching him in slow, deliberate circles. And though Ridgway seemed unshakably calm, something inside him must have sensed that the walls were tightening, even if he didn't fully understand how or why. Yet he continued his life exactly as before, trusting in the simplicity of his own deception. He didn't need brilliance. He didn't need cunning. He only needed to remain ordinary. And for years, that ordinariness had been his greatest protection. But now, for the first time, it was beginning to crack, not because he changed, but because the world around him was finally learning how to see through the mask he wore. Inside the task force headquarters, the pieces of the puzzle were approaching alignment. The picture was forming. And though the investigators didn't yet know whose face belonged in the center, the truth was closer than any of them realized. Chapter 12, The Investigation Evolves, Science Begins to Catch Up. By the late 1980s, the Green River investigation was transforming into something more structured, more sophisticated, and more relentless than anything the region had ever attempted, as technological advancements, shifting investigative strategies, and mounting public pressure pushed the task force to adapt in ways that gradually began closing the enormous gap between themselves and the unknown killer they had been chasing for nearly a decade. While detectives still relied heavily on traditional methods, interviews, surveillance, field searches, and handwritten reports, they also began incorporating emerging forensic techniques that, although primitive by modern standards, were slowly reshaping the possibilities of the case. DNA analysis, once an experimental idea, was now on the horizon as a potential breakthrough tool, offering hope that the physical evidence collected in earlier years might one day point to a specific individual. Even though the technology was too early stage to deliver answers immediately, the task force began preserving samples with far more precision, labeling every item carefully, storing it in climate-controlled facilities, and maintaining detailed logs of every potential piece of biological material. Among those early samples was the saliva Gary Ridgway had willingly provided years earlier, confident that no machine on Earth could detect the truth hidden inside it. That sample sat quietly in storage, waiting for a future no one yet imagined. Meanwhile, the task force reorganized internally, splitting into specialized units that focused on everything from geographic profiling to victimology to behavioral analysis. New leaders stepped in, bringing fresh perspectives and renewed determination to the case. They re-reviewed old interviews, rechecked alibis, compared suspect lists, and scrutinized every overlooked detail. Slowly, names began falling off the suspect list as investigators eliminated individuals who no longer fit the refined profile. Dozens of men were cleared through improved methods, leaving a smaller, more manageable pool of possibilities, and within that shrinking circle, Ridgway's name hovered like a shadow that hadn't yet drawn direct attention but refused to disappear entirely. His earlier interviews still existed in the files. His truck still matched a handful of vague descriptions. His name still appeared in witness statements that were inconclusive but unsettling. Yet because he showed such an unshakably calm, compliant demeanor, he continued to slide beneath the level of priority, blending into the middle of lists rather than rising to the top. While detectives were tightening their strategies, the region around them was changing too. Communities hit hardest by the disappearances began pushing for safer environments, volunteers organized neighborhood patrols, businesses improved lighting, cab drivers kept watch for suspicious vehicles, and activists demanded more support for young women navigating unstable circumstances. The streets where the first victims vanished no longer felt the same. There were more eyes watching, more voices speaking, more people working together to protect one another. Yet despite these changes, fear still lingered at the edges of the city, like a fog that refused to lift completely. Conversations in cafes, bus stops, and grocery stores drifted toward speculation. Some people believed the killer was still active, others believed he had moved on or died, and still others thought the crimes might have been committed by multiple individuals. Through all of this uncertainty, Ridgway lived his quiet life with the same steady rhythm that had always protected him. He worked long hours, rarely calling in sick, and performed his duties with mechanical precision. Co-workers described him as boring but harmless. Supervisors noted his consistency. Neighbors saw a man who kept his house neat, drove the same truck every day, and never caused disturbances. Even those closest to him, people who sensed his emotional distance or noticed strange absences, never imagined that the soft-spoken man they knew was connected to the case that dominated headlines. His emotional detachment allowed him to mimic routine better than most, making him appear stable even when investigators were closing in. Yet despite his outward calm, small cracks began forming in his life, though subtle enough that only those paying close attention would notice. Relationships became more strained. His temper flared occasionally in private moments. He grew more controlling in small, manageable ways. These shifts were not dramatic enough to draw police attention, but they hinted at an internal tension, perhaps a subconscious awareness that the era of impunity was slowly ending, even if he didn't fully understand why. Back in the task force headquarters, detectives noticed something important: the killer's activity seemed to be slowing. Not stopping entirely, but changing. Less frequent. Less predictable. It was unclear whether this shift resulted from increased police pressure, heightened public awareness, changes in the killer's personal life, or simple aging. Serial offenders often evolve, or retreat, as circumstances shift, and Ridgway, whether deliberately or instinctively, appeared to be reducing his visibility. Some investigators believed the killer had moved away. Others thought he was lying dormant. A few suspected he was still present, simply adapting his methods. Those theories remained unconfirmed, but they fueled deeper investigation. Detectives dug into old suspect interviews, and it was during these renewed reviews that Ridgway's name surfaced again, quietly, almost hesitantly, in the margin notes of a detective who wondered whether they had underestimated him. This wasn't enough to elevate Ridgway to a top suspect, but it was enough to keep him from being dismissed entirely. Meanwhile, as forensic science continued developing, the team began preparing for the possibility that one day, they would be able to match biological evidence to a specific person. They didn't know when that day would come, but they prepared for it meticulously, carefully preserving everything that might matter. Ridgway had no idea that the very sample he had given without hesitation was sitting in a freezer, protected from time, waiting for the moment in history when science would be ready to reveal his secrets. And so, as the 1980s faded into the 1990s, the investigation existed in a strange state of tension, stalled in some ways, advancing in others, waiting for the world to catch up with the truth. Detectives refused to give up, even when cases went cold. Families continued searching for answers, even when hope thinned. And Ridgway, the quiet man with the blank expression, continued blending into daily life, completely unaware that the tools of the future were aligning against him, piece by piece, step by step. The net was tightening, slowly, imperceptibly, but inevitably. And soon, for the first time, the distance between Gary Ridgway and the truth would begin to collapse. Chapter 13, The First Real Breakthrough, Science Finds a Voice. As the 1990s began, the Green River investigation entered a new era, one shaped less by witness memory and instinct and more by developing science, subtle breakthroughs, and a growing recognition that the tools investigators had long hoped for were finally becoming real. Advancements in DNA profiling, once considered experimental, were now reaching a level of reliability that could redefine cold cases across the country, and as laboratories around the United States began strengthening their methods, law enforcement agencies started reopening old evidence rooms, re-examining samples that had been stored for years, and preparing to revisit cases long considered unsolvable. In Seattle, this scientific evolution breathed new energy into the task force. Detectives who had spent years drowning in paperwork now found themselves standing on the edge of a potential turning point, driven by a quiet sense of anticipation that radiated through long corridors lined with case files. They began meeting with forensic experts, attending briefings on how DNA technology was advancing, and slowly embracing the possibility that the clues they needed had been stored away the entire time, silent, unseen, waiting for the world to grow capable of interpreting them. Every piece of physical evidence collected in the early 1980s was re-evaluated: clothing remnants, trace fibers, biological material preserved carefully in airtight containers, and even items that had once been considered insignificant. Among these catalogued samples sat the saliva swab Gary Ridgway had provided without hesitation years earlier, a swab he believed would forever remain anonymous within the freezer where thousands of similar samples were stored. Detectives didn't yet know that this sample would eventually become the cornerstone of the case. They simply viewed it as part of a massive archive waiting to be reanalyzed. Meanwhile, the task force renewed their commitment to refreshing older parts of the investigation. They re-reviewed suspect interviews, cross-referenced vehicle records, analyzed crime scene maps with newly developed geographic software, and held strategy meetings that brought together seasoned investigators and fresh faces who approached the case with different perspectives. This merging of experience and new methodologies created a more cohesive investigative environment, one that felt less fragmented, less overstretched, and more unified in purpose. Throughout this process, Ridgway's name resurfaced repeatedly, often quietly, often in the background, but never fully disappearing. While there remained no definitive evidence tying him to the case, certain aspects of his life began standing out in small but noteworthy ways. His residence fell within key geographic zones, his job provided a flexible schedule that aligned with certain timelines, and old witness reports describing a calm man in a pickup truck seemed increasingly relevant as investigators revisited early testimonies with a sharper eye. Still, because Ridgway lacked the dramatic traits investigators traditionally associated with serial offenders, his presence on lists remained passive, never urgent, never commanding immediate follow-up. Yet his persistence across documents made some detectives uneasy, prompting discussions about bringing him in again when resources allowed. At the same time, community fear had softened into a kind of uneasy acceptance. The killings had slowed, time had passed, and many people clung to the belief that the threat was either gone or dormant. Yet beneath that calm surface, the task force remained vigilant, especially as evolving science breathed possibility into the case once more. In laboratories across the region, technicians began applying new DNA techniques to old samples, and though early results were slow and often inconclusive, each successful test in unrelated cases around the country strengthened the belief that the Green River case would eventually benefit from the same advancements. Detectives grew increasingly meticulous in their preparation, ensuring every sample was documented with updated standards so that once technology advanced far enough, the analysis could begin without delay. Ridgway, unaware of how dramatically the world was changing around him, continued living his life with the same steady predictability. He maintained his routine at work, carried out household chores, attended occasional social gatherings, and moved through each day with the emotional flatness that had always defined him. But as the decade progressed, subtle signs of strain crept into his world, not dramatic enough to be noticed publicly, but clear enough in private moments. Relationships grew more unstable, financial pressures tightened, and his personal life became more fragmented. None of these shifts connected him directly to the investigation, yet they hinted at a man quietly losing the tight control he once maintained so effortlessly. Meanwhile, inside task force headquarters, a sense of movement began building. New leaders pushed for an exhaustive review of suspects, refining lists with modern profiling insights that challenged assumptions from earlier years. Behavioral analysts emphasized that the killer might not fit the stereotypes investigators once relied upon, urging the team to consider suspects who were introverted, socially average, or emotionally muted. This guidance subtly shifted the lens through which detectives viewed their lists, and suddenly, individuals like Ridgway, previously overlooked for seeming too ordinary, moved closer to relevance. The net tightened in ways almost imperceptible, with names once deemed low priority quietly rising in importance. By the mid-1990s, the task force had undergone another significant transformation, evolving from a tired, overwhelmed operation into a streamlined, methodical, and forward-thinking unit that viewed the case not as an insurmountable monster but as a challenge whose solution depended on patience, precision, and the inevitability of scientific progress. Detectives who remained from the earliest days observed this shift with cautious hope. They had witnessed the case stagnate before, seen leads grow cold and suspects disappear from radar, but now they felt something different, a steady, mounting momentum fueled not by chance but by the gradual alignment of technology, experience, and determination. And then, quietly, without ceremony, the first sign of the coming breakthrough occurred when a lab returned preliminary findings indicating that DNA recovered from evidence in the Green River case contained sufficient markers to attempt a match once technology improved further. Though the results were incomplete and not yet meaningful enough to identify a suspect, the significance of the development rippled throughout the task force. It meant the future held answers. It meant the killer's identity, long hidden behind silence and deteriorated evidence, might eventually be uncovered. The detectives didn't know when. They didn't know how. But for the first time in years, the case felt solvable. And somewhere in the midst of this shift, living his quiet, unremarkable life, Gary Ridgway had no idea that the world was slowly learning how to see him clearly, that the science he assumed would never matter was quietly sharpening its tools, preparing to speak truths that had been buried for decades. The investigation was no longer drifting, it was aligning. And soon, the technology that had been waiting in the background would finally rise to meet the evidence, marking the beginning of the end for the most elusive suspect Washington had ever known. Chapter 14, The Past Catches Up, Detectives Return to Old Names. By the late 1990s, nearly 2 decades after the first victims were discovered along the muddy edges of the Green River, the world had changed enough that the investigation no longer resembled the frantic, overwhelming struggle it once was. Instead, it had evolved into a quiet, patient, almost clinical pursuit, driven not by desperate guesswork but by refined profiles, improved investigative discipline, and scientific tools that had matured dramatically since the early days of the case. The task force, once scattered across departments and weighed down by the limitations of its era, now operated with a renewed sense of direction, using computer databases, digital mapping systems, and updated psychological assessments to revisit every suspect with fresh eyes. Detectives who had joined the force long after the first discoveries found themselves poring over aging files, sifting through handwritten notes, outdated interview transcripts, and decades-old evidence logs, searching for names that had slipped through the cracks. Their mission was simple: identify anyone the original investigation might have underestimated. And as they reviewed the cases, cross-referencing patterns that would have been nearly invisible in the 1980s, Gary Ridgway's name surfaced again, not loudly, not urgently, but persistently, like a quiet knock returning after years of silence. His name appeared on early suspect lists, on interview notes, on reports linking him to vague descriptions of a man in a pickup truck. He had been questioned once, had taken a polygraph, had been labeled cooperative, and then quietly filed away during a period when investigators were drowning in suspects. But now, with modern behavioral science challenging assumptions about what serial offenders looked like, the quiet, compliant nature that once shielded him no longer granted him immunity. Detectives noticed that he lived within the geographic hot zone of the case, that his routine as a truck painter placed him near key locations, and that his calm demeanor and emotional flatness matched aspects of the modern profile far more closely than the older assumptions that once dominated criminal psychology. These observations didn't make Ridgway the top suspect, but they pushed him slowly up the list, subtle, incremental progress that neither he nor the detectives fully appreciated at the time. Meanwhile, DNA technology was advancing rapidly, earning the trust of courts, investigators, and forensic scientists across the country. Labs were beginning to revisit evidence from older cases, and each successful match in unrelated investigations fueled hope that the Green River case, too, would soon benefit. Technicians began reorganizing all biological samples tied to the case, preparing them for more advanced testing. Ridgway's saliva swab, stored in a freezer for years, was catalogued among the items slated for future analysis. He had no idea the sample was still preserved, nor did he realize its significance. To him, the investigation belonged to the past, something he believed he had weathered successfully through nothing more than his ability to appear unremarkable. But slowly, the past was beginning to move toward him in ways he could not feel. Back in Seattle, detectives continued reorganizing the investigation, mapping timelines, reassessing vehicle routes, and identifying suspects who lived or worked near clusters of crime scenes. They interviewed individuals who had been overlooked and revisited those who had been interviewed only briefly in the early years. Among these renewed interviews was Ridgway's co-worker, who described him as withdrawn, emotionally distant, and oddly comfortable discussing the killings in casual, detached tones. These comments didn't prove anything, but they added texture to his presence on the suspect list. Detectives also spoke with former partners, who described Ridgway as controlling, emotionally flat, and occasionally unsettling in ways that were difficult to articulate. Yet even these accounts, while troubling, didn't provide the concrete evidence needed to move him to the top of the list. Still, each conversation planted another seed of suspicion. Meanwhile, the community had grown accustomed to hearing the name, Green River Killer, spoken with a mixture of fear and resignation. Many believed the case would never be solved, that the killer was dead or living far away under a different identity. But inside the task force, there was a growing sense that the case was nearing a tipping point, that the convergence of new science, renewed investigative strength, and a fresh generation of detectives would finally push the investigation across the threshold that had loomed for years. Ridgway, still living in the same region, continued maintaining the veneer of normalcy that had always protected him. He drove familiar streets, attended work regularly, and interacted with neighbors in ways that appeared polite but distant. His personality remained unchanged, flat, expressionless, quietly contained. Yet subtle shifts in the world around him were beginning to close the space between him and law enforcement. Computerized databases, for example, now allowed investigators to cross-reference vehicle registrations, employment records, and residential addresses with patterns across the case. This process highlighted individuals who showed up in multiple data points. Ridgway was one of them. Additionally, updated forensic methods enabled investigators to analyze trace evidence in ways that were once impossible, revealing material similarities between items collected from different locations. The task force wasn't ready to make accusations based on these findings, but the name, Gary Leon Ridgway, appeared more frequently in internal discussions. Some detectives argued he warranted deeper investigation, others believed the lack of overt red flags made him a lower. Chapter 15, The Collapse, DNA Speaks and Ridgway Falls. By the dawn of the 2000s, after nearly 20 years of unanswered questions and quiet persistence, the Green River investigation stood on the edge of a moment detectives had long dreamed about but scarcely believed would come, as laboratories across the country were now equipped with DNA technology capable of analyzing samples that had sat untouched in evidence rooms for decades. And when technicians in Washington finally began processing the preserved material from the earliest years of the case, the atmosphere inside the task force shifted from weary routine to electric anticipation, a palpable sense that the case which had once felt like an endless maze was about to reveal the path that had been hidden all along. Scientists worked methodically, rehydrating samples, amplifying DNA strands with techniques unavailable in the 1980s, and comparing genetic markers with the meticulously catalogued profiles stored in national databases. And then, quietly, without fanfare or warning, the moment arrived. Evidence from multiple victims matched a single profile, one belonging to a man who had slipped through interviews, passed a polygraph, blended into the background of suspect lists, and lived undisturbed for years. That name was Gary Leon Ridgway. The information traveled from the lab to detectives in a series of communications that left no room for doubt, and when investigators read the report, a long, heavy silence filled the room as the implications settled in. They had finally found him, not through confession, not through eyewitness accounts, but through the steady, patient march of science that had risen to meet evidence collected long before anyone imagined DNA could speak with such certainty. Detectives began piecing together a plan, knowing the arrest had to be carried out carefully, quietly, and with precision, both to preserve the integrity of the case and to prevent Ridgway from slipping away one last time. They studied his routines, when he left for work, where he drove, who he interacted with, the routes he favored, and found him as predictable as ever, still living in the same calm, methodical rhythm that had allowed him to evade detection for so many years. On the morning of November 30, 2001, officers followed him along a familiar stretch of roadway, watching as he drove the same route he had taken countless times before, unaware that the decades he thought he had outrun had finally caught up to him. When undercover vehicles boxed him in, and detectives approached his truck with measured steps, Ridgway's reaction was eerily consistent with the demeanor he had displayed throughout his adult life, calm, flat, almost detached, as though he were being asked to answer a routine question rather than facing the collapse of a secret that had shaped the lives of countless families and defined an entire era of fear. He did not resist, did not argue, did not demand explanations. He simply observed, blinked, and offered the same subdued compliance that had once convinced investigators to release him without concern. But this time was different. This time, science held the truth firmly in its grasp. As detectives questioned him in the hours that followed, Ridgway maintained the same quiet denial he had relied on for years, offering explanations that were vague enough to seem cooperative yet empty enough to avoid commitment. But the DNA matches were immovable, undeniable, scientifically irrefutable, and when confronted with the evidence directly, Ridgway's posture shifted almost imperceptibly, just enough for seasoned investigators to sense that the long-maintained facade was beginning to fracture. Behind that calm expression was a man realizing that the tools of the modern world had reached through time, past every interview he had navigated, past every lie he had told, and past every moment of confidence he once carried, dragging the truth into the present with a force he could no longer escape. As the case continued unfolding, detectives revisited every detail of his life, his marriages, his work history, his travel patterns, his habits and routines, and found that the ordinariness which once shielded him now painted a chilling portrait of someone who had weaponized normalcy with devastating effectiveness. The community watched in a mixture of shock and grim confirmation as news broke that the elusive Green River Killer had been an ordinary man living an ordinary life in an ordinary neighborhood, the same man people had passed in grocery store aisles, stood behind in checkout lines, and seen mowing his lawn on quiet evenings. Interviews with those who knew him revealed disbelief tinged with hindsight, neighbors who remembered his polite demeanor, co-workers who noted his emotional flatness, acquaintances who felt something indescribable but never alarming. All these recollections formed a mosaic that finally aligned, illustrating a truth that had existed in plain sight for decades. Meanwhile, Ridgway sat in interrogation rooms, answering questions with a calmness that unsettled even veteran detectives. He offered details in measured increments, sometimes dismissing responsibility, other times providing information with a detached practicality that felt more like recounting chores than revealing actions that had shaped one of the most significant criminal cases in American history. Over time, the weight of the evidence, and perhaps the weight of 2 decades spent living in the shadow of his own secrecy, pushed Ridgway toward confession. He began speaking more openly, acknowledging actions with chilling clarity yet maintaining the same emotionless demeanor that had defined him since childhood. Detectives listened, documenting every word, creating transcripts that would become essential to closing the case entirely. The courtroom phase unfolded slowly, methodically, with prosecutors presenting evidence that had taken decades to assemble. Families of victims sat in rows, gripping tissues, hands, photographs, anything that anchored them in the moment, as Ridgway entered, head bowed, face unreadable, no outward reaction to the magnitude of the proceedings. And when he finally accepted a plea deal that would spare him the death penalty in exchange for revealing information about additional victims, the truth poured out with unsettling clarity. His statements were clinical, factual, stripped of emotion. What shocked many wasn't just the actions themselves but the cold simplicity with which he recounted them, as though describing tasks completed across years that blurred together in his memory. Yet even in these moments, he remained consistent, a man without visible remorse, without visible fear, without visible satisfaction. Just emptiness. In the end, Ridgway was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, confined to a future where the structured routines of incarceration mirrored the routines he had once used to disguise himself from the world. He would spend the rest of his life behind bars, and though he cooperated intermittently in the years that followed, helping locate remains or clarify timelines, he remained emotionally distant, a hollow figure whose motivations could never be fully understood. For the families, the arrest brought answers but not closure. For detectives, it marked the end of a case that had consumed careers and reshaped investigative methods for generations. And for the city of Seattle, it closed a chapter defined by fear, perseverance, and the quiet truth that sometimes the most dangerous individuals are those who appear most ordinary. And as the doors of the courthouse closed behind Gary Ridgway for the final time, the world finally understood how a man could hide among them for decades, not by being brilliant or bold, but by being invisible in the most terrifying way imaginable.